My mother-in-law was good. I bet that sentence hasn't been written very often. Betty Franklin was the kind of good one's tempted to call saintly. But we shouldn't call good people saints because that strips away their humanity and responsibility for their actions. I'd wager she came out inclined toward goodness. But she was also good because she worked at it. I'd known her for 20 years before I perceived that. Once, when the hall bathroom was occupied, I went to the one attached to her bedroom. On her mirror was a post-it. "It's not about you," she admonished herself.
It's not about you. Those might be considered words to live by. And the voice you just heard reading them is the voice of a wonderful writer named Beth Ann Finley. And she was reading an essay she wrote called My Mother-in-Law in the Mirror, a tribute to her husband's late mother. Beth Ann and her husband, the novelist Tom Franklin, live in Oxford, Mississippi. Beth Ann was the poet laureate of that state for 5 years, starting in 2016, and Tommy has written 3 novels of his own and collaborated with Beth Ann on another. His first novel, Crooked Letter, turned the complexities of cross-racial friendships in the South into one of the finest crime novels you'll ever read. And I had read Beth Ann's poetry long before I met her a few years ago at the Mississippi Book Festival. And since then, my wife and I have had dinner with her and Tommy in Oxford, and Beth Ann's had dinner with us here in Atlanta. And as we got to know one another, we began to talk, as Southerners do, about Mama and them. That's how I learned that in the late teens, she and Tommy found themselves in a difficult spot. Beth Ann's mother-in-law, Betty Franklin, and Beth Ann's mother, Mary Ann McNamara Malich, were suffering simultaneously from Alzheimer's disease. Or, as Beth Ann writes in her latest book, my mother-in-law has dementia, and my husband's mother-in-law also has dementia. My husband and I are married. What, I ask you, are the odds? That book is called The Irish Goodbye, Micro-Memoirs. As Beth Ann was writing it, after the death of her mother-in-law, but as she was still caring for her own mother, she also found herself writing for the first time about the grief she carried from the unexpected death of her sister 2 decades before.
These twin deaths do always kind of cable through my life and through my dreams for very different reasons. That the shock of my sister's unexpected death and then the long, very drawn out, incredibly sad death my mother had of dementia. I moved here to Oxford in October of 2020 during COVID when she didn't want to move, but she could no longer live alone. And I took care of her from then until when she died on November 4th. She actually died after the book was turned in. So would I think of this book as a period marking the end of this? I would love to think so, because both those things have been so hard. Maybe my mom's death will recede a little bit, and I'll begin to remember her when she was younger and more competent and had more of her personality. Maybe my sister's death will start to recede a little bit now that I finally wrote about it after 20 years, which is something I've really resisted doing for a long time.
Today on Salvation South Deluxe, we're going to talk with Beth Ann about The Irish Goodbye, which details her grief through, as the rest of the title says, micro-memoirs, passages that range from only 17 words to several pages, and that will actually make you laugh out loud more often than you'd think possible in a book about grief. The Irish Goodbye is, in my estimation, one of the finest reckonings with the crap life hands us that I've ever read. It is a redeeming and generous book, and written in a form a Finley invention called the micro-memoir that has something to teach all of us who have suffered loss and lived to tell the tale. I'm your host, Chuck Reese, and this is Salvation South Deluxe. Now, you might find yourself asking what makes Beth Ann Finley a Southerner. After all, the show is called Salvation South, but Beth Ann was born in New Jersey and raised in Chicago. Her roots are in some of the coldest places in the North. But I believe there are two types of Southerners. The first are the folks born and raised here in the South, and even though they may leave and plant roots elsewhere, a part of their hearts will always belong to this region. Now, the second type is those who move here and decide to stay. But before they can be called a Southerner, they have to earn their badge, I think. Sometimes that means living here for a couple of decades, and sometimes that means that their soul just grasps what it means to be a Southerner, and they settle right in. And that second type is where Beth Ann fit in the beginning, and now she's lived in Mississippi for a quarter of a century. Beth Ann met her Alabama-born husband, Tom Franklin, in Fayetteville, Arkansas, where they were both working on their MFA degrees in creative writing at the University of Arkansas. They moved together to Mississippi in 2001. Just as Beth Ann's first collection of poems, which was called Open House, won the Kenyon Review Prize in Poetry for a first book. Open House began a stream of national acclaim for her writing, and that acclaim has continued ever since. In 2004, Tender Hooks, her second collection of poems, came out, and right out of the gate with its first poem, which was called Bite Me, it blossomed with the sass and snark of the finest Southern conversationalists. But it was her third collection, Unmentionables, from 2008, that convinced me Beth Ann Finley had a grasp of the Southern thing that was as firm as any of the born here folks. A writer who did not understand the South could never have written my favorite poem from that collection, and that was called The Kudzu Chronicles. It begins like this. Kudzu sallies into the gully like a man pulling up a chair where a woman was happily dining alone. To see our official regional weed, as it is, as ignorant to its own offensiveness as a tipsy frat boy, confirmed that the writer and her work had put down deep roots. Her Southerner by choice street cred was locked in. But I did not expect then that Unmentionables would mark her last collection of poetry. To say it is her last, of course, might very well be wrong, and I hope it is. But fans of Finley's poems, like me, have not received another collection in 18 years now. She and her husband in 2014 published a co-written novel called The Tilted World. Then 3 years later, Finley pioneered a genre she created herself, the micro-memoir, with a book called Heating and Cooling, 52 micro-memoirs. The Kenyon Review, the prestigious publication that gave Finley her first big break, called Heating and Cooling a hootenanny of a wild ride. But this second collection of micro-memoirs dives into the deepest of all human experiences, the pain we feel when we lose and as we are losing the people who created us.
What I would say is this: I'm not interested in holding back. At this point in my life, I'm 54. I'm not interested in shrouding or protecting myself. I'm not interested in photoshopping my life or my emotions. At this point in my life, I'm more interested in being vulnerable than I am about looking good.
Grief is a heavy subject, and sometimes we want to avoid it. However, when we are weighted down with grief, it can be hard to remember that positives can be found. And Beth Ann uses her writing to find that lightheartedness.
Maybe if I was trying to write a single narrative, it would have kind of felt a little unrelenting or oppressive, really, in its sadness. Because my basic worldview is that life is kind of funny. Like life has a lot of absurdity and ridiculousness and humor and levity to it. And so even when I'm approaching these really serious topics, there are certain ways in which I'm coming at it from a weird angle or, enjoying something strange about it. Even, for example, I have a piece at the end of the book that's about my friend Lloyd, whose mother also died of Alzheimer's. We would talk on the phone about how horrible it was to see our moms go through this. And we vowed that we'd help each other commit suicide at the end of our lives if it had gotten that bad. And there's just this kind of funny moment where I show it to my husband. I show this piece I've written about Lloyd, that we had made this plan, to my husband. And he said, well, at the very end, I'd want to be with you. I'd want to be the one to murder you. And I argue with him like, no, you couldn't murder me. You love me too much to murder me. And he says, no, I love you so much, I would murder you. And we have this whole conversation like, oh, that's so sweet. It's so romantic. And I know that that's really absurd, but it's also pretty much exactly as it happened. I mean, I didn't have a tape recorder going, obviously, but the dialogue that plays out in that piece is, in fact, the dialogue we had. Being in this horrible situation doesn't mean there's not times of levity.
Beth Ann's new set of micro-memoirs read like a tribute to the women it's written about, which is something modern society too frequently fails to do. But some of the pieces in The Irish Goodbye are more for those who are still here. The essay you heard a piece of at the beginning of today's episode, My Mother-in-Law in the Mirror, may sound like it was written for Betty Franklin, but Beth Ann says it's really more for Betty's son, her husband Tommy. I asked how Tommy reacted when he first read it.
He told me he was grateful that someone saw her. Because, as you pointed out, Chuck, those are the women that we look over or look past. In our culture, if you don't contribute money, you're not really contributing anything, and the choices that she made always to put other people forward, they're not rewarded in this earthly life, So I think he thought when he read that I saw her clearly, and he told me he was glad that I had written it.
In fact, Betty Franklin probably wouldn't have wanted anyone to write about her at all.
She hated attention. She didn't want compliments. She didn't want people to talk about her. She wasn't interested in anyone noticing her. She hated to be in photographs. She was embarrassed by gifts. She didn't trust compliments. What she wanted to do was serve Christ. Really, truly, she was someone who was deeply religious and made religion look good, where so many of the people, frankly, in my life who are super religious don't make it seem very appealing. I'm so lucky that I had her in my life. Like, I have this really nice husband. He's a really good person, and he loves me completely. And I think he learned to love from his mother. I think she was love.
Here's Beth Ann reading some more from My Mother-in-Law in the Mirror.
Her pleasures were simple. Her greatest was being of use. 6 of her 11 grandchildren lived next door, and 2 others close by. The remaining 3, our own, were a 6-hour drive away, an almost unthinkable distance for her, though the Franklins did make the drive a few times. "Can I fix you something?" she'd ask when a small body hurtled through her back door. Even in her late 70s, her own body failing, she'd ask that, ratcheting up her lazy boy recliner and using the remote to change her Hallmark movie to Blue's Clues. She preferred serving others invisibly without praise. She hated to be photographed, was embarrassed by gifts, distrusted compliments, dreaded clothes shopping, avoided all things fussy or expensive. She played the piano when she was alone in the house. Her beauty regimen consisted of washing her face with Pond's cold cream. I never saw her drink a drop of alcohol. Married at age 18, she never had a job outside the home, never earned a single dollar. I never once heard her wish for anything advertised on television or mentioned by a neighbor. I never once heard her ask for anything besides photos of her grandchildren. Maybe I'm so fascinated with Betty's goodness because we're opposites. Any Post-it note stuck on my vanity mirror would proclaim, "Why, yes, darling, it is about you." We're opposites in every way, but the most important one, loving her son. Tommy grew up in Dickinson, Alabama, a country store and a cluster of houses surrounded by piney woods. His asthma was so bad as a boy that he couldn't sleep at night. He had to sit up in bed because lying down made the wheezing worse. Betty sat in a chair beside his bed every night, talking with him, sometimes reading him stories, so he wouldn't feel scared when the breaths were difficult to pull into his lungs. So he wouldn't be alone with the owl-punctured dark. Tommy tells me they'd talk for hours, until finally Betty would say, "Hear that?" And he'd listen. And there it was, a log truck rumbling down the road. The log trucks started right before dawn, so this was always a welcome rumble, the signal that soon Tommy would be able to breathe. She'd kiss his forehead, and he'd slide down a bit in bed, and she'd say, "You can sleep now, sugar. You can sleep." And she'd return to her bed for her own few hours of slumber.
We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll hear more from author Beth Ann Finley about how she created the form she calls the micro-memoir. Stay with us.
You know, every day on Up First, NPR's Golden Globe-nominated morning news podcast, we bring you 3 essential stories. At the heart of each story are questions. What really happened? What really mattered? What happens next? At NPR, we stand for your right to be curious and to follow the facts. Follow Up First wherever you get your podcasts and start your day knowing what matters and why.
Welcome back to Salvation South Deluxe. As I mentioned earlier, the full title of Beth Ann Finley's latest book is The Irish Goodbye, Micro-Memoirs. The idea of writing collections of short pieces that blur the lines between poetry, the form that made her famous, and prose came to Beth Ann after the novel she wrote with her husband, The Tilted World, failed to sell as many copies as they had hoped.
Before I published my first collection of micro-memoirs, Heating and Cooling, 52 micro-memoirs, I co-wrote a novel with my husband. We collaborated on this project together. And it took us a long time. It took us 4 years. And that's pretty high stakes. You know, if you write something and you spend 4 years of your life on it and it fails, that's bad. If you and your spouse jointly spend 4 years on something and it fails, you know, that's really bad. So after I wrote and published that novel with my husband, I didn't know what I was going to write next. You know, my training is in poetry. My first love is poetry, but I was starting to kind of fall in love with the sentence and its possibilities. And I thought, well, maybe I'm going to write my own novel. Maybe I'm a novelist now. So every day I would go to my notebook and I would open it up and I would put down funny little thoughts or bits of overheard conversation or, you know, crazy memories that I had that I didn't know why I had them. And I kept waiting for them to add up to a novel, waiting for them to add up to this big arc of experience. And, you know, they kept not doing that. And I felt frustrated because I wasn't writing, but I was having fun. And also, as I've gotten older, I've learned to follow the fun. If you're having fun, keep doing what you're doing. So one day I was flipping through my notebook and I was reading these little pieces and I was thinking, well, it's not a novel. It's not poetry. It's not the type of essays that I'd published before. Then I thought of the term micro memoir. And weirdly, when I thought of that term, it almost gave me permission to understand I'd written a book of them. And since writing in Heat and Cooling, I've stuck with that form because I'm still learning from it. I feel like the micro memoir still has more to teach me. So I think I'll keep writing in this form until I feel like I'm not learning anymore.
Even those of us who choose not to write the stories of our lives, we still have these stories that we tell ourselves. Think of your high school years, for instance, and I'll bet you $10 to a donut that you have 2 or 3 stories that you think explain exactly who you were during that period of your life. But sometimes, when we revisit those foundational stories, we discover that we haven't been telling ourselves the whole truth. One of the micro-memoirs in Beth Ann's new book is called The Stories We Tell About the Stories We Tell, and it revisits a year that she spent teaching English on the Czech-Polish border right after the fall of communism.
I had a pretty unusual experience after I graduated college. I taught English on the Czech-Polish border for a year. This was in 1993. Communism had just fallen. The Eastern Bloc was crumbling. They needed English teachers, and I, volunteered to go do it for a year. And Americans at that time were starting to arrive in Prague, and Prague was filling with expats who loved the cheap rent and cobblestone streets. And there was an English language bookstore, and they had their community. I was definitely not in that situation. I was on the far side of the country in a coal mining village, very heavily communist. There was no one else who spoke English, and I was very lonely. I just couldn't make friends. I kept trying, and nobody liked me. I was embarrassed by that. I just toughed out the year and kind of went home in shame, knowing that I had failed. And that's when I was 21. Well, flash forward, I'm not able to make it back to that country until I'm 42, twice my life. Going back, now I'm a mom of 3 kids. I'm being invited to give a reading in the U.S. Embassy. And, I'm feeling so, so proud of myself and special. And going back to this country where no one liked me and I had no friends. And I went back to my coal mining village, and all these people showed up, and I realized I'd pretty much gotten everything wrong. When I arrived there, they were so poisoned by communism, by surveillance, by being spied on, that they had no ability, no resources to open themselves to a stranger. When I was trying to make friends with them, I probably threatened them. I'm sure I was terrifying in my own, way, just trying to get to know them. Probably was very threatening. And I realized the stories I'd been telling myself about what it was like to be there as a young person, and the stories that I even used to motivate myself, like, wow, too bad you didn't like me. I'm going to go on and do this and this thing. All of that was wrong. They liked me as much as they could. And I was so naive. I just didn't understand it. I was so young and dumb. And it was actually rather painful to discover that they had liked me all along, because I had to revise my thinking. And we understand we can revise our writing. We forget we can revise our thinking too, but it's hard to do that. It's hard to update what you know about yourself and see your actions in a new light.
Speaking of seeing herself in a new light, Beth Ann ends this book with an essay called Dear Viewer of My Naked Body. That's right, Dear Viewer of My Naked Body. It's about how a California painter named Robert Townsend, who makes these hyper-realistic paintings of people, came to Oxford, Mississippi, and wound up painting a dozen Oxford people in the nude, including Beth Ann Finley.
Part of the point of them was that we weren't glamorized or made beautiful. We're just very plain. I was just facing the camera, and it's experience in vulnerability. It's stepping outside of beauty culture. He was trying to get all body shapes and all ages. And I surprised myself by agreeing to do it.
When Beth Ann visited us in Atlanta a couple of years ago, she was considering allowing Salvation South, my magazine, to publish Dear Viewer of My Naked Body before it was included in her book. But ultimately, she chose not to.
Well, Salvation South has such a strong online presence that it occurred to me that anybody who was reading it online would immediately Google and try to find my portrait, and I just didn't feel like I could manage that. I just wanted someone to read the essay without looking at the portrait or feeling the need to look at the portrait, and I just feel like if it was online, it'd be too easy just to open up that search bar.
When I finished my first read of The Irish Goodbye, I went looking for that 2-year-old version of Dear Viewer of My Naked Body on my hard drive. And with the exception of the ending, the story that wound up in the book was completely different than the one that I had read 2 years earlier.
I live in a small town in the conservative rural South, and that made it all more complicated because I wasn't a New Yorker, an anonymous person. I knew that, this series of 12 would be viewed by people in Oxford and they'd know exactly who I was. So I also was trying to think about Oxford as a community and what makes a community healthy. The reason why I'm interested in that is I think a lot about my town and what it means to be a neighbor. But I also see Oxford is changing. It's gotten very popular. A lot of people buy condos here. They just use them for 6 weekends a year. And the way that phrase, the community fabric, that's starting to happen increasingly in Oxford. And our town is a little bit in jeopardy. A lot of the, middle-class houses are torn down. The people who had lived middle-class lives are forced out. So I wanted to think about these two things going together. One is my decision to pose for this painter and also talk a little bit about him and his background. And secondly, what it means to be in a beloved but beleaguered community that's important but is endangered. So the version I sent you quite some time ago had those two main essays kind of interwoven. But ultimately for the book, that piece was so long, it was close to 10,000 words. And it kind of overwhelms the rest of the collection, like I have a piece of the book that's 5 words. So 10,000, little overwhelming. And also I felt that maybe some of the stuff about Oxford, it's still important to me, but maybe it needs to go someplace else. So I ended up kind of trying to simplify the focus of that essay just to be more about vulnerability and recognition and move out some of the stuff that I had in there about what it means to be in a healthy community and how we define a healthy community.
When I saw the final version that landed as the ending of the book, here's what I took from it. Here is a woman who happens to be a friend of mine and who has gone through a very rough period in life and has clearly not given up on the joy of living. It felt like a very optimistic way to end the book.
I think that there's a way that piece is acknowledging that the pain and the suffering that we have undergone help to make us who we are, and only by accepting those parts of our lives can we kind of be comfortable in our own skin, I guess.
Like many people who will read The Irish Goodbye, I have lost both my parents. Both times the story was painful. But I loved my friend Beth Ann's book because even though I took solace from the thing that always gives us solace, the knowledge that we are not alone in our suffering, I also found myself being nourished by her words. There is a subsection of Dear Viewer of My Naked Body with the subtitle, Why I Eventually Posed. I want to read number 4 from that list. And I quote, "Well, now, I happen to have an imperfect body. It's right here under my dress. And if I rail against an ethos that obsesses over youth, if I detest the cultural pressure to lift, tuck, plump, inject, and laser, if I reject the mandate to needle botulism between my brows to reduce my thinkle, if I believe that one way we could reduce this pressure to conform to an impossible ideal would be to see bodies of all shapes, sizes, colors, and levels of ability represented without shame, should I not then offer the one imperfect body that's mine to offer? If I hate that middle-aged women are looked through, should I not then offer one to be looked at? I dare you to look through my portrait, by the way. First, I'm 7 feet tall. Second, I'm framed in fluorescent pink. Close quote. Later in the essay, Beth Ann talks to Rob Townsend, the artist, about what his intentions with the painting were. And he told her that what he wanted to get at was this question: what makes us human? Let me quote from Beth Ann's essay one more time. Maybe perceiving each other's humanity, she wrote, makes us human. Recognizing ourselves in each other, acknowledging our collaboration in the great human experiment. When confronting my own portrait, I become more human to myself. I am so clearly visible. What would be the point now in masquerading as another or as a perfected version of myself? It's too late for me to seek shelter through filters and Photoshop. Too late for avoidant poses and diffused light to distract, correct, or erase. I'm reminded that at all times, not just while confronting my portrait, I am nakedly human, flawed and alive. To prove it, I went on the record. For this one bright, brief moment on planet Earth, framed in fluorescent pink, I was alive. Close quote. I asked Beth Ann what she hoped readers would feel when they put down her book, The Irish Goodbye.
I want them to have a sense that they've gone through a journey that allowed them access to different emotions that we don't often have access to. I think we turn to books to feel more. I think we live in a world that actually only kind of shoots us in certain directions, like confirm purchase. Yes, that feeling is something that's offered to us all day long. I don't think we often get to think about vulnerability. I don't think we get to press into areas of shame. I don't think we're encouraged to think about revising our thinking about ourselves, our events. I would like it if someone who read my book ended up feeling that they had felt all the feels, like the kids say, maybe that they were surprised, maybe that they were made uncomfortable. And in addition, that they felt a sense of joy at certain places, or they laughed, and maybe they felt sad or had memories of their own life. That would be my goal.
I believe that loss becomes less painful when we begin to see what the person we lost, the person we mourn, actually left us with. What we would have missed, for example, without people like Beth Ann's mother-in-law, Betty Franklin.
When people talk about legacies, they usually mean buildings or civic projects or financial gifts. Betty's legacy is love. Her legacy is children who experienced it purely. Her legacy is the man I wed. Her legacy is my happy marriage. She died of complications due to the Alzheimer's that developed in her last years, though I've always believed she commenced her dying on February 16th, 2016, the day her husband of almost 60 years died. She took care of him from when he was in his 20s until he passed at 82. And towards the end, when his health was in decline, his body failing part by part, that care work became full-time. When he died, she lost her job. I never heard her complain until the end of her life, when Alzheimer's started damaging her neural circuitry like rats nibbling the wiring in a house, invisible, insidious, the lights in her beautiful mind going out one by one. Before the diagnosis, but after we'd noticed worrying signs, we drove to her house to take her to a neurologist. We fetched lunch from Panera for all the grandkids, and Betty put her broccoli and cheddar soup in the fridge for later. On the drive back from the tests, we heard her murmur something. "What, Mama?" Tommy asked. "I sure hope those kids don't eat my soup," she repeated. Tommy's eyes met mine in the rear view. We didn't need the neurologist to tell us she was sick. It was the meanest thing I'd heard her say in her entire life. I lost a friend to cancer, and I used to think that was the worst death, to retain all your faculties, yet be unable to stop the body's vicious revolt. Yet now that I've seen a death from Alzheimer's, I'm not so sure. The slow, relentless, inexorable coring of someone's personality, the deletions of memories, experiences, words, thoughts. This may, in fact, be worse. At the end, she couldn't always recognize her children. There was so little left of her, but goodness remained. One of the last things she said to me was, "Can I fix you something?" Hear that, Betty? It's the log trucks. You can sleep now, sugar. You can sleep.
You've been listening to Salvation South Deluxe, and we have some folks we need to thank. The first, of course, is Ms. Beth Ann Finley, who I believe is one of the South's greatest living writers. We so appreciate the time she gave us to discuss the Irish Goodbye. Thanks also to the Friends of Salvation South with whom we gather when we visit Oxford, Mississippi, John T. Edge, Blair Hobbs, Beth Ann's husband, Tom Franklin, Michael Ferris Smith, and several others who are members of that city's amazingly talented community of writers. The Salvation South podcast now has a new producer, Miranda Hawkins, who has just joined Georgia Public Broadcasting to produce this show and do many other things for GPB. This is Miranda's first show with us, and I can't wait to see what we will cook up together in future episodes. Miranda works alongside Jeremy Powell, GPB's Director of Podcasts, who produced the previous 2 episodes of Salvation South Deluxe. I also want to thank Sandy Malcolm and Bert Wesley Huffman at GPB for their ongoing support of what we do at Salvation South. You've been listening to Salvation South Deluxe, produced in cooperation with Georgia Public Broadcasting and its network of stations around our state. You can find us at salvationsouth.com, where every Sunday we bring you a new weekly edition of the South's finest writing. I'm Chuck Reese, and we will be back next month with another deluxe look at the American South. Until then, try looking for the good in people and not the bad.